morning to all. I'm very happy to welcome you for this FRS Korea Foundation program webinar. I'm Xavier Pasco. I'm the director of the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, an independent defense and security think tank based in Paris. And we're very happy to welcome you for this program in the framework of this FRS Korea Foundation program on security and diplomacy. We are very, I think, lucky to address with very good specialists this hot issue surrounding the Korea Peninsula, which we understand it now, maybe a bit late for all these years, but that is not only a regional issue, but which has global dimension and global repercussion. And so I would like to thank again, first of all, the Korea Foundation and this program, research program we have currently started with the support, because it helps us, FRS, and I would say beyond the FRS, the French research community, it helps us to explore the dynamics of this regional situation and its, of course, its repercussions on the global balance at times when the international community is being affected by many potentially disruptive trends, and I won't list them. So I will be very brief. I just want to thank again this and to highlight this cooperation and thank the Korea Foundation for the help on this. I would like also to thank His Excellency Ambassador Choi for contributing to our discussion today. At times again when things are changing rapidly, and so it's always very, very useful and rich for us to have an authoritative view and a well-informed view of an analysis of what are the dynamics of all this. And of course, I also want to thank in advance our two panelists. First, Dr. Jim Kim, a well-known research fellow at the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis and also an adjunct professor at the Yonsei Graduate School of International Studies. And I thank you very much in the name of the FRS and also, if I may, in the name of Antoine for being part and bring your expertise to our debates. And of course, Antoine Bondaz, who is, I shouldn't say so, but one of the leading research scientists on the Korea situation and beyond, and Asian dynamics and global issues related to this dynamics. So our two panelists will have ample time to present their views, and we will be, I think, able to take questions after all for our two panelists. But let me first give the floor to His Excellency Ambassador Choi for our first, I would say, presentations of the issues at stake here. So, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
So, bonjour à tous. So, can you hear me?
Yes.
So, bonjour à tous. Thank you very much, Director Xavier Pasco. And I'm very pleased to be here with you today. And I also thank the main panelist, Monsieur Antoine Bondaz, who is our best partner ever, and Madame Kim Jin-ah, who is a respected expert on the Korean Peninsula issue and beyond, and who kindly participate in today's webinar in spite of the time difference. So dear colleagues, this year is the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the Korean War. Last 25th of June, the commemorative ceremony took place in Seoul, presided by President Moon Jae-in. And on that occasion, the remains of 147 Korean War soldiers have finally returned home. We owe our freedom and prosperity that we enjoy today to all war veterans, including French battalion. President Emmanuel Macron participated in the ceremony with his video message saying that the fight of French soldiers and their sacrifices are remembered always. And Korea and France are always side by side for the peace on the Korean Peninsula. To secure the permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula, it is not an option, it is a must. However, the road to the final destination is paved with difficulties and obstacles, as we witness today. So entering the first week of June, the plot began to thicken. It started with the issue of anti-North Korean leaflet by the North Korean defectors, and successfully followed by cutting off of the communication line and the destruction of the liaison office in Kaesong. So in response, our government has expressed strong regrets and made it clear that we are prepared and ready to react if North Korea goes further, targeting the lives and assets of our citizens. Whatever the purpose, those harsh rhetoric and behavior of North Korea were truly regrettable. Unfortunately, the military action plan that the General Staff of the North Korea People's Army had threatened was suspended by the order of Chairman Kim Jong-un. Now the situation has cooled down. As President Moon put it recently in his remarks on the 20th anniversary of June 15th declaration, the Korean Peninsula is not yet there in a situation where both Koreans can charge ahead as much we desire at our own discretion. We must move forward, though slowly, with the international community's consent. So North Korea should not close the window on talks and should abstain from undermining the trust built upon until so far. We don't have alternative but to engage in dialogue and to continuously work to implement inter-Korean agreements. Of course, our proposals such as reconnecting of the inter-Korean railroads, transforming of the DMZ into an international peace zone, jointly registering the DMZ on the list of UNESCO World Heritage, and particularly the healthcare cooperation are still valid. On the other hand, as the close consultation with the United States is undergoing, President Moon Jae-in also evoked the need for the resumption of the dialogue between North Korea and the United States. Deputy Secretary of State, Mr. Stephen Biegun is in Korea today, and hopefully it will regenerate the momentum regarding the current situation. So in the past, North Korea showed more confidence with Europe, and the constructive role of the European countries, especially France, is indispensable in our common efforts. In closing, we should be always attentive to the North Korean situation, and patience should be a key word in dealing with the North Korean and the Korean Peninsula issue in general. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for this very thoughtful and useful introductory remarks. So I will now give the floor to the Judge Jimkin for a first view and presentation of how you assess the dynamics in the area, and then we will have the second presentation by Mr. Bondas, and then we have possibly exchange of views and questions. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I thank the FRS and KF for inviting me to this talk. Actually, a lot of things have happened on the Korean Peninsula for the last several weeks, as Ambassador Choi kindly explained to us. So many wonder these days why this is happening now, and to what extent North Korea's military adventurism will go in the future. So what was revealed at the Hanoi summit was the huge differences in the demands of the US and North Korea indeed. Let's say there's no overlapping wind sets, winsets between the US and North Korea. Winset is the range of options acceptable domestically and negotiable internationally. The US wants very comprehensive elimination of WMD threats, including nuclear, biochem, and missiles. On the other hand, North Korea puts Yongbyon on the table and demanded early lifting of sanctions. So for the future negotiation, either the US or North Korea should change their winsets, but it seems unlikely to happen anytime soon. The US government should accommodate domestic demands to eliminate comprehensive threats from North Korea. It also has to secure support from the US Congress in order to make a very sustainable agreement with the DPRK. North Korea is unfortunately not in a position to make any significant modification to its demand at this point. The leadership in Pyongyang cannot be entirely free from the political cost that can be possibly incurred by backing down from the promise of boosting up the economy by lifting sanctions. So I think for now, the winning strategy for the US is to just convince North Korea that the cost of no deal situation is hurting North Korea's economy. So maximum pressure is institutionalized in that way. It is not just the State Department, but many others, including Department of Justice, Commerce, and Defense that are joining the maximum pressure. So the winning strategy for North Korea now is to show to the world that its self-reliance economic system can survive sanctions, and also demonstrate to the world that its credibility of deterrence capability against the US and South Korea is indeed there. So this is exactly what North Korea is doing now. North Korea again defied inter-Korean military agreement, blew up the joint liaison office in Kaesong, and warned the military some measures against the South. Some began to worry that North Korea would begin an escalation cycle. It is really hard to predict North Korea's next move, but it is important for North Korea, indeed, to calculate whether its offensive provocations will be large enough to offset the cost that it can face in the future. In this regard, we can assume that the scope and the level of North Korea's next move will be determined by the extent of the benefits that the North Korean regime determines it can expect in return. If North Korea wants to gain the upper hand in future negotiations with the US, then its offensive level may go as far as to show North Korea's deterrence against the US by demonstrating, for example, a second nuclear strike capabilities. However, it should be also shocking enough to induce active US involvement, but not excessive enough to get the US to walk out of the negotiation anyway. If North Korea's goal is to manage internal instability and redirect some discontent to the outside, then North Korea will expect that its aggressive actions to shift criticism to their chosen target, which is obviously South Korea, while achieving a rally around the flag effect, which is very important for the regime's survival. In this case, an offensive behavior will be very, very difficult to sustain for a very long time because high-profile provocations of any kind can further aggravate the domestic instability that the leadership in Pyongyang may want to resolve. So the fundamental problem can only be solved by receiving outside humanitarian aid and sanctions relief. So I think high-profile provocation may not be an ideal option for the leadership in Pyongyang. If North Korea wants to change South Korea's attitude by showing its dissatisfaction with South Korea's North Korean policy, then it may want to disrupt a little bit South Korean society or drive a wedge between South Korea and the US. But again, high-profile provocation would unite South Korean society, not divide the society. And the alliance will move to strengthen its combined defense posture under a shared threat perception. So again, high-profile provocation cannot be an ideal option for North Korea. Whatever the reason is, North Korea is likely to is likely to adjust its level of action depending on the situation. Well, the military measures proposed by the General Staff of the Army was sending leaflets across the DMZ, making the army advance to Kaesong area in Gyeongbuk Mountain and increasing alert level, etc. However, Kim Jong-un at the political bureau meeting decided to temporarily hold those measures. That's exactly what I explained to you. Another option that that North Korea can consider may include disrespecting buffer zones on the ground, sea, and air, or reopening gun ports along the NLL in the West Sea. But North Korea is likely to consider, I would say, reversible measures as a viable option, because broken communication lines can be reconnected and collapsed buildings can be rebuilt anyway. Therefore, what we need to worry about is a situation like a stability-instability paradox, because we cannot rule out the possibility that North Korea will try to make a much bolder attempt at a low-level provocation while refraining from high-level provocations. So this becomes possible when North Korea will choose a method of provocation to prevent further sanctions and meet the objective of securing time, buying time needed for developing and mass producing new weapon system, while ensuring North Korea issue on the table, on the top of the US and South Korea's policy agenda. So in the past, North Korea has engaged in multiple types of provocations, like clashes along the land and sea borders, detaining South Korean and US nationals, and freezing South Korean assets. But we had a few mechanisms back then that could be used to halt all those provocation cycle in the past. Well, like the events at the Gyeongbuk Mountain, reunions of separated families, and visit to North Korea for many reasons, like religious, sports, and cultural exchanges. All these measures could play a very positive role in managing the crisis situation on the Korean Peninsula in the past. And in 2010, 14, and 15, the two Koreas also engaged with each other, because South Korea provided health and medical assistance to the North in order to deal with swine flu, Ebola, MERS outbreaks, and many others. So, but these options are not available at this point, which is really concerning me. President Moon changed his foreign policy and national security teams, and this kind of change of the people who is in charge of talking with the North signifies South Korea's commitment to engage with North Korea. Well, these changes is very important, and I think in order to make a breakthrough, I think all the concerned countries has to cooperate. If neither the US nor North Korea makes compromises, then we may have two options left. The first option is going back to the proposal offered by North Korea at the Hanoi summit, which is step-by-step approach toward the denuclearization. The second option is recognizing North Korea as a nuclear-armed state and working on arms control instead, in order to handle, I think, proliferation concerns. Personally, I don't like the second option. The first option is not at all ideal, but it can be suboptimal option. US concerns are losing leverage and partial implementation by the North. But I think we have to be very creative in thinking about ways to solve these problems. The end state should be very clear anyway, that is dismantlement of the entire nuclear program in the North. But if we have to start from Yongbyon facility, what can happen next is inspection team will apply very strong verification method to find out connections between Yongbyon and other places as well. It'll be very much easier for us to ask North Korea to disclose other related activities then asking North Korea to disclose everything at once. What North Korea demanded was going back to tailored sanctions, easing some restrictions on the trade of commercial items unrelated to WMD program. Then we can come up with a conditional sanctions lifting, such as monthly limit to North Korea's export of all those items. And then we can review North Korea's compliance every month and decide whether to continue sanctions lifting or not. I think, what I'm saying is we have to be very creative in our thinking about how to engage with North Korea, because South Koreans are trying to open the window for further dialogue with the North. So I think the international support for this kind of new initiative is very important. Well, I think I spent almost 10 minutes, so I'll stop here and look forward to further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very thoughtful remarks. And I like the notion of creativity you mentioned to help find a way forward and a solution to this very tricky and difficult situation. So I will now very briefly give the floor to Antoine to complete possibly this view from our place here.
Thank you very much, Xavier. It's always a pleasure to interact with Ambassador Choi, and especially with Dr. Kim Jina, who among her generation in Korea is clearly one of the best experts. So it's always a great pleasure to interact with her. As the ambassador said, I just wanted to start with the 70th anniversary of the beginning of the Korean War and why it matters for France and Korea relations. Because for most people, you know, it's a very old war, etc., with no direct implication for France, but that's not the case. And I think the Korean government, the French government clearly showed it with President Macron actually recording a short videos to commemorate the beginning of the war. And the fact that in terms of cooperation, but also our interests, the Korean War is still very symbolic and still very, very important for both Paris, of course, and Seoul. You've shown it during the COVID-19 crisis when the Korean government sent actually some mask and personal protection equipment to the veterans, the French veterans of the Korean War, etc. So I wanted just to start by thanking our Korean friends and to remind our French friends, of course, that Korea still matters. It mattered 70 years ago, and it indeed still matters today. The name of the event was mostly on the deadlock, and clearly Kim Jina, focused on it, and I'm very thankful. And I will basically focus on 3 deadlocks, if I may say. The first one, I would say the deadlock, of course, on the nuclear issue and the broad issue. Because even though there is no nuclear test, even though there is no long-range missile test, and even though the North Korean nuclear program is no longer at the top of the agenda, of the mediatic agenda, is still, of course, a very, very important issue, be it for Korea, was said before, also for France, for the EU, etc. And that issue of non-proliferation, at a very specific time when the NPT REFCON, the revision conference, and the NPT was delayed because of COVID-19, is still very, very important. Just to give you one figure, North Korea last year in 2019 tested more ballistic missiles than Kim Il-sung during his war era or Kim Jong-il during his war era. Last year was 22, if I'm not wrong. 22 tests of short-range ballistic missile from North Korea. So the nuclear program is still on, indeed, as well as a ballistic program. And that crisis, I would say, is still the most serious proliferation crisis the European Union, and including France, of course, is facing today. Especially because there is increasing risk of proliferation of these kind of new missiles, short-range missiles, including solid rocket propellant missile, and the dissemination of technologies. And this remains very, very important. France, of course, has been highly committed on it. The EU is still highly committed. And behind, I would say, the the newspaper and the mediatic agenda. There is, of course, the proliferation agenda, and we should, of course, keep discussing with our partners, South Korea, the US, of course, Japan on that issue, because even though it's not at the top of the agenda, it's still, of course, a major issue. The second issue is, of course, inter-Korean relations and kind of one of the deadlock, despite South Korean huge involvement and commitment and very positive gestures over the last 2 years. It was actually very, very surprising over the last few weeks when we received actually a lot of solicitation for the media, French media, explaining us, but why is North Korea doing that? And the first question is basically, what did South Korea did? What did South Korea do that entail actually that North Korean answer? And as Kim Jin-ah said, I think the North Korean motivations are the main reason, and it's not because of South Korea. The current deadlock in the inter-Korean relations, I would say, is not new, and it comes from the growing and the full combination between two goals. The improvement, of course, of inter-Korean relations and the denuclearization of North Korea. And these two objectives that are still, of course, the main two objectives of the South Korean government are now clearly intertwined, and what was possible 10 or 15 years ago is now much more complicated. We cannot improve the inter-Korean relation to a certain extent because it's now linked and intertwined with the nuclear issue. And we see it with the economic sanctions on North Korea. We see it in terms of cooperation between Korea and the US and its other partners. And that, I would say, is one of the main reasons why there is this kind of deadlock. As Kim Jin-ah said, South Korea is trying to be very innovative and creative. And I would say that the art of diplomacy, to paraphrase Bertrand Badi from Sciences Po, diplomacy is the art of managing separations. And I think that definition clearly fits between the two Korea. And we know well that the South Korean government has been very, very active in trying to not only convince North Korea that they should make progress on the nuclear issue, but also in convincing some of their partners that engaging North Korea is important. And that third, and the third deadlock, I would say, is, of course, and as I was reminded before, the US-North Korea deadlock. The key question is whether these negotiations will go anywhere before the elections in November. And so far, and Kim Jin-ah once again clearly explained it, I don't see why the North Korean would accept a major concession from the US government in the coming month. I hope that there could be a deal. And I really enjoy actually the idea that no deal is actually no deal would be detrimental to North Korea. This is what, of course, we need to convince the North Koreans, when for months back in 2018 and 2019, the focus was mostly, is it a small deal? Is it a big deal? Is it a big enough deal, etc.? As was said before, the key idea that no deal is not a good deal and no deal is not the good situation. So the key question will be whether North Koreans consider, and in Pyongyang, that President Trump can deliver anything in the coming month. I'm not that pessimistic. I'm not that optimistic, I would say, because clearly it's no longer on the top of the agenda of President Trump. The relation with China and other international issues, and including domestic issues, will be much more important in the coming month. And as Kim Jin-ah said, the key question will be for the North Koreans whether they need to get the upper hand before the election or just after the election. If the North Koreans consider that Biden will be elected or is elected in the full 2020, we may expect further provocation, so that the North Korean might get the upper hand in the coming negotiations. And I would say that January 2021 will be a very, very decisive month for two reasons. First, because the new US president will be sworn in, and second, because there will be in the US, also in New York, the revision conference of the NPT. And de facto, North Korea will be again on the top of the agenda. And the key question is, how do we prepare for the 2021 and especially for January 2021? On that aspect, I will be very brief also on saying that there is a some debate, I would not say a lot of debate, I will be honest, within the European Union on how we can contribute on the North Korean issue. Some commentaries were published over the last few months. Some people basically saying that it's time to talk to North Korea and that we should even more than before support South Korea's policies toward North Korea. Some other people asking for a more multilateralized US-DPRK dialogue, or even to draft a so-called Borel peace plan on the Korean Peninsula. I will try to be a bit more pragmatic, I would say. I think we need to be honest and to acknowledge that the strategy of critical engagement from the European Union has partly failed on North Korea. Of course, North Korea did not denuclearize, and relations did not improve that much between the EU and North Korea, but it's only a limited failure because the objective, of course, of the EU strategy was not by itself to solve the issue, but at least to contribute to it. And one of my main recommendation when I wrote a paper for the EU a few months ago as part of the consortium on non-proliferation, the FRS is part of, was basically to maybe renew or reinvigorate the EU and EU member states' policy toward North Korea from a so-called strategy of critical engagement, the current strategy, to a more proactive strategy of what I call credible commitments. And credible commitments of the EU in 4 areas, in terms of political engagement, in terms of non-proliferation, of course, in terms of implementation of restrictive measures, and in terms of engagement with the North Korean people. And as was said by South Korea and the president a few weeks ago, the key question of the North Korean people should also remain one of the compass. And I really appreciated actually the offer of South Korea to focus on one concept, the concept of human security, be it in terms of inter-Korean relations, but also in terms of South Korean foreign policy. The concept of human security is not new. It emerged in the 1990s within the international organization, especially the UN. And I really believe that key concept of human security is something we should work on more in dealing with North Korea, but also in cooperating with South Korea on North Korea and other issues. And I will be very, very glad in the coming month if Europeans and Koreans can maybe start to think a bit more in concrete terms, in which case the concept of human security could be used. Because in human security, there is of course the key question of security, and that's once again one of the top priorities in terms of proliferation, etc., for the EU, but the key question of the human being is also something very important. And over the last 2 or 3 years, sometime in the US, sometime in Europe, we were discussing a lot nuclear weapons, a lot Kim Jong-un, Chairman Kim, and the leadership, but maybe not enough the North Korean people, and more globally, I would say human beings and people. And the pandemic of COVID-19, of course, reminded us all that if you have no human security, you also have no security at all. So I would be very glad in the coming month, maybe the Europeans and the Koreans can start to brainstorm maybe to begin with, and then to offer some concrete recommendation on how we can basically seize the end that was given by President Moon on focusing on human security, and maybe dig a little bit more in this concept and what we can do in terms of concrete cooperation between France, Korea, the EU, Korea, etc.
Thank you, Antoine. I fully concur with you about this, about reinvigorating this notion of human security, which was born at the UNESCO in the UN context years ago. And I agree with you that this is, and this has always been viewed in Europe as a promising concept for renewing diplomatic talks on security issues. And it's maybe very, very much appropriate in this particular case to try to use these tools. And the EU, and I really, we didn't discuss that before, but I really agree fully with you that the EU and South Korea could very much agree and enrich mutually by exchanging on this line. We have a question here, but just before this, I would like to ask Kim Jina, what would be your expectations regarding the upcoming US elections and potential outputs? And as Antoine mentioned, do you share these views, and how do you see the whole dynamics in this respect?
Well, I think, as I told you, there is a bipartisan support for the idea of comprehensive elimination of WMD threat from the North. And what North Korea criticizes is not just such a demand to denuclearize North Korea, but hostile, so-called hostile policy imposed toward North Korea. And this hostile policy, by definition, from North Korea's point of view, is very, very comprehensive. It includes traumatizing North Korea's human rights situation, for example. And all these sanctions are imposed on North Korea, not just because of WMD issues, but because of cyber threats and political system there and many others. So the fundamental problem here is North Korea demands a very comprehensive change in US policy, which is not going to happen anytime soon unless there is a denuclearization of the North. So I think even after the election, even after the change of the government in the US, I think this fundamental problem is really hard to handle between the two sides, the DPRK and the US. What we have to be concerned about is, well, I think even Joe Biden, if he becomes the president, well, I think he does not like the idea of killing the current channel, the communication channel between Washington and Pyongyang. So I think he may want to revitalize the talk with the DPRK. But there should be some learning curve that we have to consider. So I think the critical moment for us to think is between the election and February, when the speech at the Congress will be held. So this, I'll say, this is the golden time for changing, for us to engage with the US government to review their current policy in a positive way. And another thing that we have to be concerned about is possible change of the organizational structure. At this point, the negotiation team is having support from all the bureaus within the State Department. If this negotiation team is still there, then the US will continue to use this channel to engage with North Korea, and it will continue to work on North Korea issues. So I think the institutional and organizational change that may or may not happen after the election is very critical for us to understand what is going to happen afterwards.
Thank you. Antoine, you want to add something on this, or we can go to the first question we have here? Okay. So we have a question regarding the assessment you can have of the COVID-19 situation in North Korea, and do you see it as do you see a link with the return of Kim Jong-un provocative actions, or do you see somewhat of a direct relationship between the current dynamics and this developing situation? Maybe Kim Jong-un on this?
Yes, of course. I do believe that can be one of the reasons why North Korea is showing assertive actions toward the outside. Well, I told you South Korea is a easy scapegoat here. North Korea, well, actually after the outbreak of the coronavirus, North Korea, well, North Korea is suffering from self-imposed sanctions by closing down all the border transactions between North Korea and China. Although North Korea denies that there is no case domestically but there were some reports about the people who became quarantined. And there are some other reports regarding some border control again and again. And North Korea actually closed down the schools, but it reopened in June. But again, it closed it down. And that also convinces us that something is really happening inside. And regarding the economic situation, last year in 2019, the North Korea's export to China dropped by 87%. And this year, early this year, well, the number actually dropped by 80% again. And that tells us that North Korea is suffering from economic difficulties. And quite recently, North Korea is mentioning that the leadership should improve the life of the people in the capital city. That again tells us that there is something going on even in Pyongyang. And we still see that there's no dramatic change regarding the price of pork and rice, possibly because of the leadership's control over the major banks in North Korea. And there are some reports about selling bonds to so-called donju to attract more money from all those citizens. So that's why North Korea is just muddling through this situation. But I'm not sure how long North Korea can do this type of things again and again in the future. So I think, yes, again, I think there is some connection between North Korea's assertive actions and its domestic economy.
And if I may, I would add two very, very concrete dimension. The first one is in terms of diplomatic negotiations. Because of the COVID-19, it's much more difficult for North Koreans than before to negotiate. It's harder for the diplomats to go out of the country, to come to Europe, to go to even China, etc., to negotiate, either bilaterally or with third countries, etc. So it makes current negotiation with North Korea even more complicated than before. The second aspect, in the economic aspect that Kim Jina, of course, underlined, including in terms of tourism, because 2020 was supposed to be the key year in North Korea to attract foreign tourists, and including, of course, and mostly Chinese tourists. But the fact that Wonsan complex, touristic complex cannot be open, the fact that Samjian complex is still closed, etc., is a huge opportunity cost for the North Korean region, that they had invested a lot of money with the idea that they would attract foreign tourists, and they cannot deliver. And that is, in addition, of course, of the self-imposed section, etc., a huge cost for the North Korean economy. And one of the questions is, how long can they sustain the economy? I'm not saying that the regime, of course, will collapse, because they will sustain it, but what will be the economic impact and also the social impact, societal impact, and as Kim Jina said, including in Pyongyang, on this border being closed for maybe too long.
Thank you. I just want to remind our audience that questions can be posed in the chat section. So please feel free to ask your questions. I have another question, this time about China. And it's in this particular situation that we all experience nowadays. And with the development we see in the Chinese diplomacy, I would like to have your views on how the DPRK fits in the whole picture. If you have ideas on how it fits from the Chinese perspective and how it can be affected by a larger diplomatic trend we see developing in the Chinese policy these days. Where is DPRK fitting in this whole picture as seen from the Chinese perspective? Please, Mrs. Kim Jina.
Well, I think China's role is very, very significant. What North Korea is doing, I think, is just make some disturbance in the northern part of China to get some attention from China, because it is critical for the Chinese government to stabilize these kind of troubles in the north and focus more its energy on settling all the issues happening in the south, Taiwan and Hong Kong. So I think if North Korea is very, very clever, then it's a best strategy for the leadership in Pyongyang to make some disturbance. And in exchange, North Korea can expect some help from China. Because as I told you, North Korea's reliance on, in terms of economic assistance, its reliance on China is huge indeed. And without China's support, I think North Korea's strategy to muddle through the situation cannot be really successful. And at this point, North Korea has to show to its domestic people that all the construction project has been conducted in a very good, in a positive way. At this and quite recently, the North Korean party decided to work on nationwide disinfection project. And one of the key projects is building Pyongyang General Hospital. And what China can do is assisting all this construction project, especially this building of General Hospital, because it is not helping North Korea in this way is not a violation of the UN Security Council resolutions, right? And what North Korea can expect is, well, I think continuing to engage in low-profile provocation to disturb South Korean society, to review our policy toward North Korea, but not in a way to antagonize China or Russia. And what China can do is, well, if these kind of situation can be managed well, then we can actually talk about more assistance for humanitarian purposes to North Korea. And that's what China and Russia has demanded so far at the UN level. So I think in this way, there is some kind of strategic relations going on between China and North Korea at this point.
Thank you. Antoine, do you have a view on this?
I mean, China still remains, as Kim Jong-un said, a very, very significant player and can do a lot to support and assist North Korea. One of the questions is to what extent North Korea is willing to diversify or can diversify its partners, because the level of dependency of the North Korean regime on China is unprecedented. Unprecedented from the 60s, 70s, unprecedented for a few years ago, etc. And one of the key questions is how long can the North Korean elite sustain that very high level of dependency on China, or do they consider that this is not an issue? A few years ago, we could see that the North Korean officials were really willing to diversify their economic partners, political partners, etc. It's of course much more complicated now with the sanction and with the COVID-19, of course. But to what extent can we play that as Europeans, as South Koreans, to play that card of you don't want to rely too much on China, and we can provide some assistance if, of course, conditions are being met.
Thank you, Antoine. So I have new questions for you, maybe to close this this session we have. First, what do you think the DPRK put a sudden stop? What do you think the DPRK put a sudden stop to its violent anti-Iraqi campaign, threatening rhetoric, blowing up the inter-Korea liaison office, military buildup in the DMZ? What were the Pyongyang objectives? What did they achieve? You can read this. So this question about this gesticulations and provocation in a sense. And the second question addresses the last book of John Bolton's and his reaction on the Trump's approach to the summit with Kim Jong-un. What do you think of this? Could you quickly address these two questions and tell us your views on it?
Can I go first? Right. I think what North Korea is doing is to test water by making some rhetorical provocation and then wait and see what's really happening in the US and South Korea. I think there's a role division between Kim Yo-jong and Kim Jong-un. They're playing, perhaps as many others also analyzed, that there's a good cop and bad cop thing going on between the two. But in this way, what North Korea can show to the world is actually Kim Jong-un holds the key, because he made a critical decision to hold all the military measures suggested by the military. And there's no military actions at all at this point. So by doing so, Kim Jong-un showed to the world that he has that kind of authority. And at the same time, Kim Jong-un is going to see what's going to happen in the future, because he already mentioned the US should change its attitude and change its calculation regarding denuclearization talks. So I think what North Korea is doing is just to wait and see some signs of change. And regarding Bolton's book, well, somehow we expected that during the Hanoi summit, President Trump's concern was not really about his negotiation with Chairman Kim, but his domestic problems. So that was not a surprising news to me, but I think Bolton has his own opinion. How to interpret the situation can be different.
Before giving the floor to Antoine, maybe I will ask you about your view about Kim Yo-jong and her new role. How do you see this? How do you assess this rising role from your view?
But in North Korea's history, there has not been, there was no second man in charge, no second woman in charge anyway. So what Kim Yo-jong can do is just supporting the regime, not disturbing the regime stability. So I think at this point, he is just playing a bad cop role to make some criticism, to make some noises. In that way, Kim Jong-un can be free from any kind of criticism of any failure of his strategy to engage with the US or engage with South Korea.
Antoine?
Yeah, I fully agree with Kim Jong. I think there is a key difference between the media attention on Kim Yo-jong and the institutional position of Kim Yo-jong. Yes, indeed, she's a younger sister of Kim Jong-un, but she's only the first deputy director of one of the departments. If she gains new position, then maybe in terms of domestic politics, she might have a bigger role, etc. But so far, it seems that she's used mostly for communication purposes, because once she says something, people listen, especially abroad. If the director in charge of inter-Korean relations would have said the same, no one in Europe basically would have commented. And we would not have had that many press articles. But since Kim Yo-jong is in terms of the media attention very high, as soon as she says something, then it will be commented. And it brings me to the question on inter-Korean relation and why did the anti-ROK campaign stop? I think that the North Korean actions were very calibrated. They were targeting South Korea and only South Korea, because as Kim Jin has said, it's a very convenient scapegoat for two reasons. First, they don't have that much to gain from South Korea right now. If they want to talk to the US, they can do it. They don't need South Korea. And South Korea cannot make huge concessions to North Korea, or at least North Korea consider that South Korea can no longer do. So they don't have a lot to lose, especially since President Moon has a new majority after the national elections, and in his line, his position, his strategy toward North Korea has been re-legitimated, I would say. And the second aspect is that they've been very, very careful in the last few weeks not to target the US and not to target the US-ROK alliance. Even the provocation in Kaesong were focusing on inter-Korean relations. If they had moved more troops in the DMZ or made a military provocation, then it could have become a provocation against the whole alliance. And so far, what we have and what we read and what we see is that it was very calibrated on South Korea, because they know that the impact would be highly symbolic, including for domestic gains, to find a scapegoat, to show that the leadership is powerful, etc., without risking either sanction or a shift in terms of South Korean policy. So I think it was very, very calibrated and not, I would say, unplanned strategy. And very briefly also, because someone asked on Japan and Korea relation and the impact for North Korea, I would say it's of course important for North Korea, but even more for China. Not competition, but sometimes disagreements, let's put it that way, between Seoul and Pyongyang and Tokyo, sorry, is perfect for China. What China and Chinese strategists have been afraid of for years is more trilateral cooperation between Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo. And as long as you have a very weak side in the triangle, then it's very positive for the Chinese. So I think the main beneficiary is maybe even more China than North Korea.
Thank you, Antoine. I think we can take maybe the last question for this session. I think we'll have to close in a few minutes, but we have a question, as you can see, maybe that that is addressing this notion of human security and its, let's say, it's a realistic perspective in the context of the DPRK. Do you see this human security approach as being efficient or effective in this context, given the fact that the DPRK has a relation, a very specific relation with this notion of human being and security? And so do you see it as we discussed it a moment ago, do you see it as a real effective tool that the EU could really push in let's say in a relationship, future relationship, whatever they are, with the DPRK in this context?
Well, I think there are pros and cons about this approach. Clearly, humanitarian assistance is not a violation of the UN sanctions if there can be an exemption authorized by the Security Council Sanctions Committee. And this year, 2020, we can see that there are almost 18 cases of exemptions authorized by the UN Security Council regarding humanitarian assistance to North Korea. This includes food and water and medical and health and infrastructure related assistance as well. So I think that can be our leverage to talk with the talk with the DPRK. But we have to be also careful about this approach, because the fundamental issue regarding human security is protecting human rights. And North Korea does not want to talk about human rights. And China does not like to talk about human rights. On that regard, I think we should be very careful about it.
Thank you. Antoine, you want to add something?
Yeah, I fully agree. There is, of course, huge limitation, but to talk about human security, maybe not directly with North Korean, but at least among us, can also be a good way to put the North Korean people also back within the equation, in which for maybe too long, we've had discussion on a lot of technical issues, and of course, denuclearization is key, and it will remain on the horizon, and it remains the key objective, and there is no debate even about that. But the concept of human security at least can broaden a little bit the scope. And I was using that term because once again, it was in one of the speech of President Moon, because it's a way also to include non-traditional security issues, etc., and a way to, I would say, not defocus from the North Korean issue, nuclear issue, sorry, but to broaden the scope without forgetting that for the North Korean, the improvements of the people living condition is also important. I'm not saying this is a top priority, and we've seen it, but that's a way also for the regime, sorry, to be more legitimate. So maybe there is some room, at least among us, maybe in the later periods with the North Koreans, but at least to discuss maybe broader issue than just and only the nuclear and ballistic issue.
Thank you, Antoine. Thank you for this last precision. Thank you, and I speak under your control, Antoine, but I think we have reached the end of our today webinar. I thank you very much. I would like to thank, in the name of all the audience, I think the two speakers for their presentation and the ability to put all this difficult situation in perspective and give some very good hints and to help understand. I want also to thank Your Excellency, Ambassador Choi, for your contribution and your introduction of this seminar. I want to thank also our audience and for the questions also, and also for your, I know, attentive watch of our debate. So this is concluding our today webinar. Maybe Antoine, you want to add something for the program we can think of?
So thank you very much to all of you. It was very useful. It has been recorded, and I will try to post also the video on the website because many people went on holidays, etc. So that's also a good way for people to watch it later. And I'm glad we have this first webinar. It's only starting. I guess it's not going to be the last one, but it's also a new format that sometimes can be useful, including right now with the pandemic. So I think this is an interesting format. We need to maybe work even more on that. And once again, thanks a lot to Your Excellency, and thanks a lot to Kim Jong-un.
Thank you. Thank you to all, and it was a great pleasure spending this hour plus a few minutes with you all. Thank you. Thank you, Your Excellency.